So, as we pause for the notes here, yesterday, of course, we talked about the labor market, and that's what the bell ringer was about. You can type the answer in Canvas chat. Hopefully, you're able to work on the Econ 4 ads assignment, which is to watch the various advertisements that are displayed and then fill in information in the document. Just 2 facts and 1 interpretation for the first one, and then 5 facts and 2 interpretations for the rest. And at the end, right, which do you believe had the most influence on sales and why? Oh, yeah? Oh, you can just change the name on the last one or the next one.
There's 9 commercials, but there's 10 boxes.
So delete one of them?
Yeah.
Okay. The for the notes today, we'll look at organized labor. And so, why are unions important? They're a lot smaller than they used to be. There aren't as many union members, so why do we have to know anything about them? Well, first of all, they're responsible for most of our labor laws. So laws involving pay, hours, work conditions, most of those are there because of unions. Also, they still have an importance in vital industries. Whether manufacturing airplanes or cars, for instance. Nurses are often unionized, so there's quite a few vital industries that still have union members. And there's around 15 million union members altogether, which out of 335 doesn't sound like a lot, but obviously as a block of people, they have a little bit more influence. And of course, as time goes by, you'll look at different industries that will also unionize in the future. But if we look at early union development, before the Civil War, there really wasn't much of a reason. People didn't work in mass in one place that often. Most people were in agriculture and worked independently. But then, of course, the Civil War happened, and after the Civil War, we had broad industrialization. So lots of people started moving to cities in particular and working in mass in factories. Once that happens, though, these people start to talk and they realize that their jobs are dangerous or they don't pay that much. And so they start to, as a group, become concerned about their labor. And in fact, in 1886, Samuel Gompers, which is spelled Gompers, he's the guy in the bottom left-hand corner there, he would help begin the American Federation of Labor, an organization that still exists today. Of course, one of the obstacles was the fact that we're a nation of immigrants. So not all the time were unions welcoming, and not all the time did immigrants want to join because they were fearful of their status and they didn't want to cause trouble by joining a union. So that sometimes caused an issue. You also had a division between craft unions, which were specialized by skill, and industrial unions that were for broader groups of people. Craft unions were for specialized skill, and industrial unions were for broader groups of people. So if you went to a steel mill and a modern day steel mill, let's use this example, and let's say they have a team of electricians and you had a union just for them, that would be a craft, or sometimes they're called a trade union. But if you organized everybody in the steel mill, no matter what their job was, it would be called an industrial union. So you had some divisions between those two groups as well. Not only that, but sometimes strikes could end in violence. The Homestead strike would be one example in 1892. And the Pullman strike, which is spelled Pullman, which involved rail workers, about 50,000 of them. Now, that isn't to say the union was the one that was always guilty of the violence. Often it was both groups, both the employer and the employees. But needless to say, this also made Americans suspicious to some extent. What type of activities did they develop that many unions today will still use? Well, first off, their main goal is to collectively negotiate. Collectively negotiate. So they negotiate items for the workers as a group. And what kind of things do they negotiate for? Well, those are pretty obvious. Pay, benefits, which can be a wide-ranging group of things, like sick days and insurance, vacation time, breaks, and working conditions. And this is actually one of the biggest concerns of workers at the time, because in the late 1800s, you could be maimed or killed at work, and really there was nothing that could be done for you. In fact, if you were maimed, you'd be fired because you couldn't work as hard anymore if you were missing an arm. So that was a concern that was especially big in the late 19th century. Another one, of course, would be job security, because one of the things that employers often do when they hear someone even whispering about forming a union is they often get fired. That's technically illegal today, although there are always ways around the law. And of course, how did they achieve organizing so they can negotiate as a group? By using the threat of a strike, which is a work stoppage, which is obviously risky because you can be eventually replaced by outsiders. There's also picketing, which is parading around an employer, often with clever signs. And then, of course, boycotts, refusal of buying products, which ultimately probably isn't a wise thing for unions to do, because they're going to convince people not to buy the very products that, hopefully, if their strike ends, they're going to come back and make. Employers use a variety of tactics, including lockouts, which is until this contract issue is settled, they might refuse employees entrance. That is also risky for an employer because then they're not making money. Also, hiring replacement workers, a derogatory term for them are scabs. Replacement workers. And then another one would be company unions, where the company sets up basically a pretend union to make people feel like they're doing something, but in reality, it's just a trick. And the company union isn't going to actually end up making a difference in their lives. These are sometimes also called yellow dog unions. And then there's the attitude of the law, which has certainly changed over the years. Before the Great Depression, the law was mostly anti-union. People were scared of them. They're violent. There were rumors of involvement with communism. And obviously, big companies And wealthy people like the Rockefellers of the world or Carnegies were friends with governors of states who would often send in the militia to break up strikes. But then when the Great Depression happened, lots of Americans, of course, realized the misery of working life. And so you started to see a big uptick in union membership, but also pro-union legislation. So during the Great Depression, you saw a lot of things throughout the country be made completely legal. Peaceful strikes, pickets, boycotts, and negotiating contracts would all be made legal throughout the country. The biggest of these would be the 1935 Wagner Act, which will set up the National Labor Relations Board. The National Labor Relations Board. And that's the one that oversees labor issues in general, not just for unions in the United States. Around this time, John Lewis will also set up the Congress of Industrial Organizations. John Lewis will set up the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO. This will represent people that weren't usually welcome in the AFL, so mostly industrial workers. And this just shows there was room for two big groups of unions in the United States because membership had grown so much. During World War II, FDR got most unions to agree to not ask for pay raises. He was incredibly worried about inflation, and he knew pay raises would just cause inflation to go up. Most unions agreed to that. Not 100%, but most would. But after the war was over, all of a sudden you started to see a flood of strikes. A lot of unions said, hey, companies like GM and Ford have been making lots of war profits. We would like our fair share because we've been working hard at these factories. And so you started to see a wave of strikes at the end of World War II. In response, or I guess one of the parts of that would be the formation of the United Automobile Workers, or UAW, which is one of the stronger manufacturing unions today. 1947 UAW. But then you started to see a decline in interest in unions. And part of that was because of their own success. For instance, unions pushed to get past the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act. And the Fair Labor Standards Act established a minimum wage for the first time, which back then it was well under $1. It set up a 40-hour work week, which still stands today. 1.5 times for overtime pay, often referred to as time and a half. And it also ended child labor. And these were some of the major concerns of workers and families. And so after this was passed, a lot of people just say, well, do we really still need to join unions? So in a combination of these kind of laws being passed to protect everybody and this wave of strikes after World War II, you started to see anti-union opinion. And that is why the Taft-Hartley Act was passed. Taft-Hartley Act was passed. And there's two major points that the Taft-Hartley Act introduced. One is that unions can't donate to political parties. And the other thing they would establish is known as right to work. Right to work. And what right to work says is that people can't be forced to join unions. People can't be forced to join unions. Because sometimes unions would get into the contract that says if you want to hire anybody new, first they have to join the union. So this made that illegal. If the state that you're in agrees with that, states do have the option of allowing right to work or not allowing right to work. Pennsylvania is not a right to work state. Most of the right to work states are in the South, where people are free to not join unions. The South is also where wages and insurance are a lot lower than they are in the North because not as many people belong to the union. And eventually, the AFL-CIO merged into one organization. So today, when you see it referred to, it's AFL-CIO. This is an umbrella group that represents most unions in the United States. Today, unions, of course, really aren't involved in incredibly lengthy strikes or violent ones, but they do sometimes get stretched out over the long run. So, I really shouldn't all be opening the screen, but collective bargaining does have its flaws. Even today, it can be a long process, dragged out for several months, maybe even a year. And in that time period, nobody's getting paid. It does require a compromise, and obviously, compromise always makes people upset. But they do fight for things and include things such as better wages, benefits, work conditions, and of course, a grievance process where unions, on behalf of the members, the average employee, can complain about something officially that the employer has done. So those things are all possible in modern negotiations. Amazon, for instance, if you're not aware, their warehouses are often have terrible work conditions. Their employees are often pushed to continually be on their feet, moving around packages constantly. They have quotas they have to meet. They're not allowed, supposedly, to take restroom breaks. Amazon denies that. But one of the things that sometimes workers are hoping for at those warehouses is that they'll unionize and they'll be able to improve working conditions. But they exist in the South where unions are less popular, and that often doesn't happen. Anyway, if there is no type of agreement in a negotiation, also a third party can get involved. You can either get a third party to help mediate or compromise, or you can find a third party that will arbitrate, which means they'll make a final decision. In the case of police and firefighters who are not allowed to go on strike, they automatically go to an arbitrator to make the decision for them. And of course, the government can get involved in a labor dispute. An injunction, which is spelled INJUNCTION, an injunction is when the court orders a labor dispute to stop. So an injunction is possible. An injunction is possible. And a government can also be involved in what is called a seizure. SEIZURE, which means it can seize control of an industry or particularly a business if it's considered vital to the country. For instance, in the early 20th century, when coal miners as a whole went to go on strike, the government threatened to become involved because It was necessary for heat and energy, and so the government threatened to take over the entire coal industry if they ended up going on strike. But of course, the trends haven't been in unions' favor. Membership has declined to less than 10% of the labor force, mostly because a lot of industry is white collar based services where people don't feel the need to join unions as much, or people aren't as permanent in their jobs. If people are switching jobs every 2 years, obviously you're not going to be able to form a union. And there's new technology, which has replaced a lot of people that used to have union based jobs. And so that's why you've seen a continual decline in union membership. And today, most of that membership is actually amongst government employees. It's not necessarily in the private sector. There are some still pretty prominent trade-based unions. Electricians, for instance, carpenters, in some cases, not all, actually have what are called union halls, where you have to apprentice in order to become part of the union. But once you do that, you're guaranteed to have contracts that are offered to the union hall. And that can also include jobs like boiler makers, for instance, and masons and carpenters. Obviously, there are independent people that do those jobs out there, but some of the best paying ones belong to unions specifically. For the remainder of the period, if you didn't get the ads assignment finished, please make sure that you do so for the remainder of the period. And then, of course, tomorrow we'll be looking at sole proprietorships and partnerships and the rights of employees and businesses when it comes to firing.